Well, that's going to be the major cultural war issue, right? Because the fact is that I, as a parent, believe that if you're going to teach...
You think there's no systemic racism?
I believe that it depends on how you define systemic racism. So if you're talking about legal regimens of racism, no. If you're talking about history has after effects, of course. So I think there's a real problem with semantic overload in a lot of our political conversations. And when people say systemic racism, sometimes what they mean by systemic racism is history has consequences. You can't have 150 years of, 300 years of slavery followed by Jim Crow and that not have after effects, which of course is true. And sometimes what they mean is that every inequality in American public life is due to some systemic inequity that is currently taking place in the United States, which I think is absolutely 100% false.
I mean, we certainly see that playing out in our criminal justice system. Are you going to deny that, or are you going to say that, let's say, African Americans or Latinos are just inherently more criminal? Or
I'm not going to say either of those things. I'm going to say that.
So why are they overrepresented in our prisons? I mean, especially when you consider...
This may be beyond the scope of our conversation, but the answer is because not all groups commit crimes at the same level. That has nothing to do with genetics. That has everything to do with circumstance.
This is where the debate changes. Anna keeps dragging the conversation back to real-world consequences, while Ben tries to trap it in definitions and theory. The longer it goes on, the clearer the tension becomes. What begins as a discussion about education and culture turns into something much bigger: power, inequality, media manipulation. And who truly benefits from the system? Anna keeps forcing specifics, then keeps retreating into abstraction.
Like this.
So there are parts of that I agree with, some parts that I disagree with. For the most part, I just want to note that the idea of America is an incredible idea. I think that the country has failed to live up to its ideals. I think that there are certain things that are transpiring as we speak that go unchecked. You know, we are supposed to have a system of checks and balances, but I think more often than not, we see a system that is in fact rigged in favor of the powerful. I'll give you specific examples. You know, in the beginning of the pandemic, there were lawmakers in the Senate who engaged in this minimalizing, like just completely minimizing the severity of the pandemic, to the point where I actually didn't think that COVID was a serious threat to me, my health, my family's health. In fact, in February, I went on a cruise with my in-laws and had a great time and didn't think that COVID was going to be an issue. Then I find out, of course, a month later, everything starts shutting down. People I know get incredibly sick. And then news reports come out in regard to members of the Senate who had a classified briefing, closed-door briefing on the severity of COVID, and immediately turned around and started selling their stocks. They started buying tech stocks, realizing that people are likely to work home, so they might need to invest in technology or companies that offer technologies that make that possible. Basically, there's insider trading happening within the Senate. And I'm saying it out loud, and I'm saying it on a regular basis, because that kind of activity, that type of behavior, first of all, is illegal for the average American, should not be legal for members of the Senate. The fact that we have... The fact that we have lawmakers who are personally invested in businesses that they're deciding legislation on is unacceptable. So when you talk about the lack of trust in our institutions, I understand that lack of trust. And that lack of trust has led to the situation that we're experiencing today with COVID, where people don't believe in what the CDC is telling them, where people question what journalists are reporting about. They just assume, because of the lies that have been told, because of the system being rigged against them, they just assume that they're being lied to. And now we find ourselves in this difficult position where we're trying to find solutions. We're trying to come together so we combat COVID effectively, get people back to work so people can thrive, families can thrive. But that's incredibly difficult to do when people don't trust in our institutions.
Anna cuts through the usual left versus right performance and points straight at corruption. She doesn't keep it abstract. She names real examples: senators trading stocks after private COVID briefings, lawmakers profiting from systems they regulate. That's why her argument hits harder. Ben talks about institutional decline, but Anna shows exactly why people stopped trusting those institutions.
Decay.
Yeah. No, I mean, you actually brought up a few issues that I agree with. Number one issue is the constant policing of people's pasts, what they've said in the past. I think holding people to the current standards based on the current culture. If you're looking at tweets, for instance, from 2009, and you're judging that tweet based on what the current culture or the current standards are, it's a little ridiculous, right? So going around demonizing people based on their past statements, it shuts down a conversation that could be had, right? A conversation about, oh, hey, look, society has actually progressed on this, and, look at what was okay. I mean, you have late night hosts who were in blackface not too long ago, right? But the culture has changed. I think that, society as a whole, not everyone, but society as a whole has realized, oh, well, blackface has a pretty terrible history, and maybe it's not a good idea to dress like that as like a cute little Halloween costume. But beside the point, I don't think that the culture wars are fake. I think the culture wars are taking place. The point that I'm trying to make is that oftentimes, whatever the culture war is of that moment, it is manufactured as a distraction. A perfect example will be, critical race theory, which is not taught in elementary schools. Critical race theory is a graduate level curriculum. And the fact that it's turned into some weird, like, oh, we need to ban critical race theory in elementary schools, it's ridiculous and a massive distraction that I think is intentionally meant to be a distraction from what people are really feeling frustrated about, the precariousness of their lives, of their work lives, the fact that people feel overworked, that they have no control over the work that they're doing, that they feel alienated over the work that they're doing. These are very real issues, and I think that, the fact that it's really largely been ignored by both the press and the very political leaders who were elected to represent them in the first place has led to the anger that we're seeing bubbling up both on the left and the right.
This is one of Anna's strongest moments because she exposes the culture war as a business model. I'd use that outrage is amplified because it's profitable. And while Ben partly agrees, Anna takes it further. These fights distract from economic insecurity, burnout, and declining living standards. That turns the debate into something bigger than social media drama. And for once, it puts Ben on defense.
It's for once.
I'd like to respond to that, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
To argue that the corporate tax rates in the United States are too high, or that, first off, let me just touch on the comparison you gave regarding progressive taxes in European countries versus the United States. I mean, yes, the taxes might be higher in those European countries, but what do people living in those countries get in return? They get incredible childcare. I mean, listen, the average American family, two-income household, spends a whopping 22% of their household income on childcare alone, right? So when you're talking about European countries that offer quality childcare, that, by the way, that opens up the opportunity for people to go to work, something that we should maybe think about as we're dealing with this labor shortage. 64,000 women left the job force in April alone. Not because they want to, but because they can't afford childcare. Everything in this country is privatized. Everything has a for-profit model. And there's consequences that come along with that, including for the business community that might want, a more robust social safety net program or social safety net to ensure that people feel comfortable enough to go to work, but we don't have that here. So yes, people might pay more in taxes, including those lower on the income scale, but what they get in return is far greater than what people in this country have been getting.
The United States has spent, since the beginning of the war on poverty, some $22 trillion in the war on poverty. We spend an awful lot on social services in this country on a per capita level. In fact, it is very much on par with what the European countries spend. It's just not spent particularly well. When it comes to things like childcare, a very young Elizabeth Warren, before she became Senator Elizabeth Warren, specifically wrote about universal childcare, and she said that it actually was contributing to what she called the two-income trap in a book that she wrote in the early 2000s. And what she talked about is the fact that there are a lot of women who, for example, may not want to work, and what you're actually doing is incentivizing incentivizing people to have to go to work because you are now providing child care, as opposed to providing a competitive advantage to, for example, families where one parent is working. I agree with you, by the way, that child care is a very difficult issue. I also agree that this is why we used to have, for example, family structures that were conducive to allowing people to help out. There are many businesses that do provide for some form of child care. We certainly have many businesses that provide for some form of maternity or paternity leave. The European countries, which obviously have been used as a model by a lot of folks on the left, between 1970 and 1993, they experienced exorbitantly low rates of growth. And the reason for that was because they radically overburdened their social safety net systems. It created enormous social problems. It created enormous immigration problems. They had to scale a lot of those back. And
why would it create immigration problems?
It created immigration problems because a lot of people were coming specifically for the benefits.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yes, that would be to my point, which is it creates more problems very often than it's
sure, I guess that's a.
Yes, if I put a free donut sign in my shop, people will come for the.
No, but if you have a society that actually takes care of its workers, right? If you have a society that makes your life a lot easier, people are going to want to immigrate. It's part of the reason why people wanted to come here. People are going to want to live in countries that have both economic opportunity, but also social safety net programs that, again, just make your. We talk about freedom. If you look at the World Freedom Index, okay, we like to think of the United States as the freest country. We're not the freest country. You look at that list, we're like pretty low down compared to a lot of these Nordic countries. Denmark is top of that list. So look, Denmark has a mixed economy. When we have these debates about socialism versus capitalism, I think that those debates are a little ridiculous because every country is not every country, but most countries are mixed economies.
Right. The United States is a mixed economy.
Exactly.
Yep.
Now, the issue with the United States is there used to be a time when public universities were free, right? You didn't have to dig yourself into a massive hole to get an education. There was a time in this country where there was universal child care. That was cut down to the point where it's like no longer in existence unless you're desperate and have like no money and need to take advantage of some programs that are available in some states. But my point is, like, we have an issue here where on one hand, we're experiencing a labor shortage. We want people to go back to work. On the other hand, people literally can't afford the childcare necessary in order to put their kids in a daycare, put their kids in childcare, and be able to go to work without their entire paycheck.
The Biden bill removes many work requirements for many of the payments that are being made to people, and it's incentivizing people not to go back to work, which is why we have 10 million open jobs in the United States and people not coming back to work.
That is not what that bill does. In fact, that's not what that bill. Are you talking about the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill?
I am talking about the $3.5 trillion bill.
The $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill offers universal pre-K, which opens up the opportunity for mothers to go to work if they want to go to work. The $3.5 trillion bill, by the way, has all sorts of subsidies for corporations, which I don't really understand why the business community isn't salivating over that, because rather than just going full force with public programs, which I think would be the right way to go, it's offering all sorts of subsidies in these, public-private partnerships. Now, the physical infrastructure bill has a lot more corporate giveaways, which is why the, business community absolutely loves it, offers the chance to privatize public infrastructure, which is why the business community absolutely loves it. But at the end of the day, if we don't create a society where Americans can actually have families and go to work, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Anna keeps grounding the debate in real life. Childcare, wages, housing, and work. She's not arguing theory. She's asking whether the system actually works for ordinary people. Now, that puts Ben in a tough spot. His answers stay ideological, while Anna's point is simple and hard to dodge. People are feeling pressure every day, and the system isn't solving it.
Yeah. So those are the ideas that actually, funny enough, have been repeated over and over again in our education system. The idea that, children or students in this country are taught that capitalism is evil is new to me, because I certainly did not get that type of education. Quite the opposite, in fact. Freedom is an interesting way of framing it, because the fact of the matter is, if you are financially stable, if you are, in the top 10% of this country, for instance, you probably feel incredibly free. You have options, endless options available to you. You probably have a nice nest egg. You have a little bit of that economic freedom. But, there are two different things at play. Number one, well, when you look at what is incentivized under capitalism, it's actually led to a lot of our own civil liberties being violated. For instance, data collection that takes place on a regular basis without our own knowledge by these social media companies, by these tech companies who make their money not off of advertising, for instance. They make the majority of their money off of selling our personal information to data brokers. It's part of the reason why there are infinite websites right now, so-called data brokers, that just sell our personal information, including where we live, what our phone number is, where we've worked. I don't really feel very free when I'm terrified about my own safety, because there's a company that's literally making money off of selling my personal information. So there are certain incentives under capitalism that actually do infringe upon our civil liberties and our rights. So that's one thing that I want to note. But the other thing I want to note is, how free do you feel if you're on the precipice of financial ruin, if you can't afford paying for a medical emergency that you're experiencing? What do you do when you don't have health insurance, which tens of millions of Americans right now don't have because of the exorbitant prices associated with it? How free do you feel if you're a wage worker who has not experienced your real wages increase in literally decades? Wages have not kept up with inflation. So how free do you feel when you want to leave your job, but you can't, because your health care benefits are tied to that work or tied to that job? I mean, freedom, again, is an interesting way of framing it, because I would venture to say that there's a significant portion of the population in the United States, significant portion of workers in this country, that do not, in fact, feel free, in fact, have experienced the precarious nature of a capitalistic system that forces them to work endlessly, if they're lucky, in a full-time job, if they're unlucky, in several part-time jobs that they cobble together with no benefits just to make ends meet.
Let me give you 30 seconds, because I want to move on something with that.
I'll just say, I think that there's a bit of a definitional game that's very often played with the word freedom. Freedom obviously has two separate meanings. Isaiah Berlin talked extensively about the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty. What you're talking about are things that people need and things that people want, and that is not the same thing as liberty.
I'm talking about what people need. People need health care.
I don't disagree that people need health care, but to characterize that as a freedom is a very different thing. If the goal of the government is to provide you the opportunity to seek things, right, then that is not the same thing as the government providing those things to you directly. Nor is it the same thing as the government seizing that thing from one person and giving it to you here. To characterize it as freedom is a real mischaracterization. Again, I'm happy to discuss whether or not we should change the programming here, but I think that the sleight of hand that's played by equating freedom of speech, for example, or freedom from being murdered on the street, or freedom to dispose of your capital as you see fit, to characterize that in the same language that would use to discuss why you need a house, it's a difference in kind. It's apples and oranges.
Yeah. So let me just quickly
Okay, go ahead. I want to ask you a question.
Point,
go ahead.
Because this idea of taking something from one person and giving it to the redistribution issue, which I think oftentimes is framed inaccurately. When we talk about redistribution of wealth, I mean, look at the amount of money that gets invested by our federal government in the form of research and development, whether we're talking about pharmaceutical companies or even companies like Tesla. The seed money from Tesla did not come from private investors. In fact, the same year that Obama's administration invested in the failed Solyndra project, they also invested the same amount into Tesla. And guess what? Tesla ended up being a massive success. The only downside to it, though, is that now you have Elon Musk, who's whining and crying about having to pay his fair share of taxes, when during the pandemic he became, for a brief period of time, the richest man literally in the world.
By the end of the debate, the contrast is clear. Ben keeps returning to systems, incentives, and philosophy. Anna keeps pulling the conversation back to real life. She brings up senators trading stocks after private COVID briefings, families unable to cover a $400 emergency, child care eating up income, and women leaving the workforce because care is too expensive. That's why her argument lands. Whether you agree with her or not, it feels connected to reality, not detached from it.